This is not supposed to happen in Texas. A magnitude 5.1 earthquake just tore through the middle of cattle country, and the strangest part of this story has nothing to do with the shaking itself. It has to do with a buried scar in the earth that shares its exact blueprint with one of the most violent earthquake sequences in American history, hundreds of miles away. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly what is sitting underneath the Texas Panhandle and why even the experts cannot fully agree on what just happened there. Let's get into it. Early Thursday morning before sunrise, the ground shook hard across a stretch of ranch land in the Texas Panhandle up near the Oklahoma border. A magnitude 5.1 earthquake is genuinely extreme for this part of the country. When most people hear the words Texas and earthquake in the same sentence, their mind jumps straight to fracking. But let's be clear about something right away. A quake this size would be unusually large, even for an earthquake triggered by human activity. Typical fracking-related tremors register under magnitude 1, far too small for a person to even notice. Induced earthquakes can occasionally climb higher if drilling operations happen to intersect directly with a pre-existing fault line, but what happened here is genuinely unusual, and it has already made national news. So I spent the last several hours digging through this story, and what I found is that this is an earthquake even the experts cannot fully agree on. Here are the basic facts nobody disputes. The quake struck at 5:21 in the morning, centered in a rural stretch of Roberts County, not far from the small town of Miami, Texas, close to the Oklahoma border. People felt it as far away as Oklahoma City and Tulsa. A second, much smaller tremor followed later that same day, hundreds of miles south. Nobody was hurt, and there was no significant structural damage. Here is where things get genuinely strange, though. I read through nearly every major outlet covering this story, and not one of them agrees on exactly how rare this event actually was. Some are calling it the strongest earthquake ever recorded in the Texas Panhandle. Others are calling it the strongest in more than a century. A few outlets are being more specific, saying it is only the fourth earthquake of magnitude 4 or higher ever documented in that region, going back to the year 1900. So which is it? And why can nobody seem to agree on the basic facts of something that happened just hours ago? I think that contradiction is actually the most interesting part of this entire story. So stick with me, because I am going to walk you through 4 completely different explanations scientists have floated for what is happening underground in Texas right now. And the most honest answer might be the strangest one of all. Let's start with where exactly this happened. The epicenter sat in Roberts County, deep in flat, quiet ranch and farmland, closer to the Oklahoma state line than to any Texas city most people would actually recognize. The quake itself was shallow, only a few miles beneath the surface, which is exactly why the shaking traveled as far and as strongly as it did. This was not just a local rumble. It reached all the way into Amarillo, Leach, Oklahoma City, and Tulsa. Reports came in from southwestern Kansas and from the northern edge of the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Some residents said they felt shaking from a source located nearly 250 miles away. People in small towns near the epicenter described being jolted awake by a sound like rolling thunder. Except this thunder came from underneath them instead of from the sky, which for a region that regularly deals with genuine thunderstorms, tornadoes, and hail says something about just how strange this felt. By breakfast time, hundreds of felt reports had already flooded into the United States Geological Survey. Within hours, seismologists across 3 separate states were suddenly paying very close attention to a corner of the country that, under normal circumstances, almost nobody in that profession thinks twice about. And here is something most people watching this do not realize. The Texas Panhandle has actually been quietly shaking for more than a century. Records of seismic activity in that specific area stretch back to 1907. Since then, researchers have logged roughly 20 separate earthquakes across that same general stretch of land. 3 of them before this latest one crossed the magnitude 5 threshold, occurring back in 1925, 1936, and 1948. A handful more followed in the decades after that, in 1995, 1197, 4, and 1980. So what exactly is sitting underneath all that quiet panhandle wheat and cattle country? This is where the story gets genuinely old in the geological sense. There's a fault system buried underneath this entire region, and it is not some brand new crack that appeared out of nowhere. Geologists have traced it back to something called the Amarillo-Wichita Uplift, the buried remains of an ancient rift, a place where the continent itself once tried to tear apart and simply failed to finish the job. This failed rift dates back to the early Cambrian period, roughly 500 million years ago, long before dinosaurs existed, long before anything with a backbone had even crawled onto dry land. So is this ancient buried scar the culprit behind Thursday's earthquake? Do not jump to conclusions just yet, because there are 4 separate explanations on the table, and they genuinely might surprise you. This ancient scar is not simply sitting there doing nothing. It rests quietly beneath the wheat fields of the Panhandle, mostly silent for enormous stretches of geological time until modern stress somehow finds its way back to it, or at least that is one theory. But here's the catch. The numbers do not fully line up, and that contradiction is worth unpacking properly. Let's go back to that disagreement I mentioned earlier about whether this was the strongest quake ever recorded in the region, or merely the strongest in a century. The explanation turns out to be stranger than the discrepancy itself. An earlier Panhandle earthquake, reported at magnitude 5.4 back in the 1930s, was never actually measured by a seismograph at all, because there was not one anywhere near that remote stretch of land at the time. Instead, scientists of that era estimated the earthquake's size after the fact by mapping where people reported feeling the shaking and where any damage turned up. In other words, they were reconstructing an earthquake from old letters, newspaper clippings, and reports of cracked plaster on someone's living room wall. That estimate might genuinely be close to accurate, but it is fundamentally a number built from human accounts, not instrument readings, which makes it very difficult to compare directly and fairly against Thursday's earthquake, which was captured in real time by modern seismic instruments reading the ground directly. So, when different outlets describe this week's quake as the strongest ever recorded, they most likely mean the strongest ever measured by an actual instrument, not necessarily the strongest earthquake to ever physically occur in that region throughout its full history. Once you separate those two categories, most of that confusing disagreement clears up. It is not that reporters are getting the facts wrong. It is closer to comparing an old hand-drawn sketch to a modern photograph and then arguing about which one is more accurate. That distinction actually points towards something a bit uncomfortable. The full picture of Texas's seismic history is considerably blurrier than most of this week's dramatic headlines make it sound. Which brings us to those four competing explanations for what actually caused the ground to move on Thursday morning. Scientists have not fully ruled out a single one of them yet. Explanation number one is the one we've already been building toward, the idea that this ancient failed rift essentially woke back up on its own. This is currently the leading natural explanation. Tectonic stress slowly accumulates across an entire continent over long stretches of time, and every so often that stress finds the weakest available point in the crust and releases there. In the Panhandle, that weak point happens to be the same old failed rift system we just described. Under this explanation, no human activity is required whatsoever. It is simply geology doing what geology has always done, operating on a timescale that makes an entire human lifetime look like the blink of an eye by comparison. Explanation number two is one that almost nobody is currently talking about, even though it is genuinely interesting. Old oil fields dating back many decades. Several historical Panhandle earthquakes, including ones recorded in 1936, 1966, 1974, and 1980, happened directly above major petroleum fields that were actively being drilled at the time. Researchers who studied those older events suggested they may have been triggered by that historical oil production. But those same researchers were also honest about a real limitation in that theory, since the equipment available back then simply could not pin down the precise depth or location of those earlier earthquakes with much accuracy. So, this remains a genuinely open scientific question, rather than a settled conclusion. Explanation number three is the one most people jump to first the moment they hear the words Texas and earthquake together. Modern wastewater injection tied to oil and gas drilling, commonly linked in the public mind with fracking. This is a real, well-documented phenomenon in Oklahoma and in parts of West Texas. Researchers have clearly documented cases where pumping leftover fluid from oil drilling deep underground has measurably triggered earthquakes along nearby fault lines. However, officials responding to this specific Panhandle earthquake have been notably cautious, saying plainly that more data is needed before drawing any firm connection. A magnitude 5.1 is genuinely large for an earthquake caused primarily by fluid injection. And unlike the well-documented, extensively studied cases further west in the Paran Basin, this particular event simply does not have that same level of supporting evidence yet. Which brings us to explanation number four. And you might actually laugh at this one, because the honest answer right now is that nobody fully knows. And in my opinion, that might be the most honest answer of all four. Within hours of this earthquake, scientists were already saying exactly that publicly, that determining the true cause of an event like this takes real-time, careful data collection and detailed modeling, and that accumulated stress can absolutely reactivate an ancient fault entirely on its own, with zero help required from anything happening on the surface. In science, hearing the words "we do not know yet" is not some kind of cop-out. It is usually, and in this specific case I genuinely believe it is the single most accurate sentence in the entire story. But here's the detail that actually stopped me cold while researching all of this. Geologists studying the Amarillo-Wichita uplift have pointed out that it shares a strikingly similar structure with something called the Rialute Rift, another ancient failed buried rift system sitting deep underground in a completely different part of the country, and that particular rift system happens to sit directly beneath the New Madrid region, where the borders of Missouri, Arkansas, and Tennessee all meet. That is the zone responsible for the legendary New Madrid earthquakes of 1,811 and 1,812, a sequence so powerful that some accounts from that era describe the Mississippi River appearing to briefly reverse its own flow direction. To be completely clear here, no scientist is currently suggesting that Texas is somehow due for a repeat of anything on that scale. Nobody's predicting a New Madrid-style disaster in the Panhandle. What geologists are pointing out is actually narrower and honestly more interesting than a simple doomsday prediction. Both regions share the same fundamental geological ingredients. An old, failed rift buried deep beneath the surface, silent for hundreds of millions of years at a stretch, following essentially the same basic recipe. One of these ancient scars just happens to sit underneath Texas wheat fields instead of underneath the Mississippi River Valley. So what happens next? The United States Geological Survey ran its forecast within hours of the quake, putting the odds of another earthquake of similar size or larger occurring in the coming days at roughly 2%. That is small, but it is not zero. Their damage modeling came back showing low overall risk, largely because so few people actually live in that specific rural stretch of the Panhandle, meaning serious injuries or major economic losses are considered unlikely. But here is why the size of this particular earthquake actually matters so much statistically. The Panhandle has now experienced roughly 4 earthquakes of this magnitude or larger within about a century, which works out to something happening, historically speaking, somewhere in the range of once every 25 to 30 years. Push that threshold up just slightly to somewhere around magnitude 5.5 or 5.6, and the odds shift dramatically. Scientists estimate an earthquake that size only shows up in this specific region roughly once every 50 to 100 years. Push it further still up to magnitude 6, and you are talking about something closer to a once-in-3 centuries event. So this magnitude 5.1 earthquake is not some bizarre statistical fluke. It looks a lot more like a clock finally striking the hour it was always eventually going to strike. Nobody knew exactly when that hour would arrive, because that is simply how earthquakes work. There is no way to know in advance with real precision. Let's talk a little more about that second, smaller earthquake I mentioned earlier. The one that struck later the same day, hundreds of miles south of the main event. That quake, measuring roughly magnitude 3.9, hit near a different part of central Texas entirely, unrelated geologically to the ancient rift system sitting beneath the Panhandle. It is worth mentioning specifically because it briefly caused some confusion online, with a few people assuming the two events were connected, maybe even aftershocks of one another. They were not. Texas is simply a large state with multiple separate zones of seismic activity, some ancient and largely natural, others more directly tied to modern industrial activity. And having 2 unrelated earthquakes strike on the same day in completely different regions is really more of a coincidence of timing than any kind of connected event. It is also worth explaining a bit more clearly how scientists actually study whether an earthquake was triggered by human activity in the first place, since that question keeps coming up throughout this story. Researchers typically look at a combination of factors together. They examine the precise depth of the earthquake. Since injection-triggered events tend to cluster at depths closely, matching the depth of the wastewater disposal wells themselves, they look at the exact location relative to any active injection sites nearby. They study the timing, checking whether seismic activity in an area increased noticeably after nearby injection operations ramped up. And they compare the specific fault that ruptured against the broader regional stress patterns already mapped out by geologists. When enough of these factors line up together, scientists can build a fairly confident case, connecting an earthquake to industrial activity. When they do not line up cleanly, as appears to be the case so far with this specific Panhandle earthquake, the honest scientific position is to withhold judgment and keep gathering additional data rather than jumping straight to a conclusion. There's actually a peer-reviewed study from 2022 published in a respected geology journal that looks specifically at earthquake activity across the Texas Panhandle between 1983 and 2018. That research found a sustained rise in smaller earthquakes magnitude 2.5 and above across that multi-deed window, and it concluded that a majority of those specific smaller events showed signs consistent with being linked to underground wastewater injection tied to the oil industry. That is genuinely useful context, but it is also worth being careful about what it does and does not tell us that earlier research was focused on a large number of smaller, more routine earthquakes accumulated gradually over decades. It was not specifically studying an isolated event anywhere near magnitude 5, which is exactly why officials responding to this week's earthquake have been so hesitant to simply extend that same explanation onto this particular event without further investigation. Let's go a little deeper into the New Madrid comparison too, because I think it deserves more context than a quick mention. The New Madrid earthquake sequence of 1,811 and 1,812 remains to this day widely considered among the most powerful earthquake sequences ever recorded in the history of the continental United States. Multiple massive earthquakes struck that region over the span of just a few months, strong enough to be felt as far away as the eastern seaboard ring. Church bells in cities hundreds of miles distant and permanently reshape parts of the local landscape. Because that region had almost no population at the time compared to today, the human toll was relatively limited given the sheer scale of the event. If a sequence of that same magnitude struck the same region today, given how much has been built up across that part of the country since the early 1800s, the consequences would look dramatically different and far more severe. What makes the structural comparison between that region and the Texas Panhandle genuinely interesting to geologists is not that anyone expects a repeat performance. It is that both areas represent what geologists sometimes call failed rifts. Places where hundreds of millions of years ago the North American continent began attempting to split apart entirely, only to stop partway through the process for reasons scientists are still working to fully understand. Instead of finishing the job and forming a brand new ocean basin, the crust essentially healed back over, leaving behind a long buried scar weaker and more fracture prone than the surrounding rock, patiently sitting there for the rest of geological history, waiting for the right combination of stress to reawaken it, even if only briefly and on a far smaller scale than what happened in 1811. Understanding that shared geological heritage does not tell us exactly when the next moderate earthquake might strike the Panhandle again. But it does help explain why this region, quiet as it usually seems, is not entirely as stable and predictable as most residents have always assumed it to be. So where does that leave us? The ground genuinely shook harder in the Texas Panhandle than any seismograph has ever directly recorded there before. That part is settled fact. 4 separate explanations remain technically on the table, and scientists have not settled on just one of them yet. And underneath this entire event sits a 500 million-year-old scar carved into the Earth's crust, one that shares its basic structural blueprint with one of the most violent earthquake sequences in American history. What happened in Texas this week was not something impossible. If anything, it was something that had essentially been quietly preparing to happen long before the state of Texas even existed in any recognizable form. That scar was already sitting there in the ground, patiently waiting. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, make sure you are subscribed to this channel because we track exactly these kinds of strange, underreported natural events every single week, explained clearly and honestly without unnecessary exaggeration. Let me know in the comments if you had ever heard of the Realute Rift or the New Madrid earthquakes before watching this, because I genuinely want to know how many of you were already familiar with that piece of American geological history. I will keep a close eye on any new developments coming out of the Panhandle, and I will bring you an update the moment there's anything meaningful to report.